This marks the end of Trigun Maximum as a series, as it concludes in these final 4 volumes. 0 Hour, Gunslinger, Double Duel, and Mind Games are all part of the final arc of the series, and could be viewed as different stages in that storyline. With Volume 11, 0 Hour, being the bridge between the heartbreaking swan song found in Volume 10 to the opening salvos of the climactic showdown. Volume 12, Gunslinger, is where the true final battle begins and everything starts to get crazy and intense, followed by Volume 13, Double Duel, being the earth-shattering deathmatch Yasuhiro Nightow has been building to since 1996, and everything comes to a close in Volume 14, Mind Games. The series has had its ups and its downs, its triumphs and failures, the creator's weaknesses being rivaled only by his strengths. But in the end, the finale of Trigun isn't perfect, but it ends well and is worth exploring. Million's Knives and his airship rapidly approaches the last city of man, the final stronghold standing against the extermination of all human beings on the planet. Having survived the battle against the eyes of Michael and buried his fallen friend, Vash the Stampede travels to the city to confront his brother and his psychopathic servants. But he won't be doing this alone, as Levo the Double Fang has decided to join him in the battle against his former masters. There is one last stretch of the journey for our Scarlet Inhuman pacifist gunslinger and the reforming assassin. Million's Knives, Elemdira the Crimson Nail, and Legato Blue Summers. A host of angels under the control of a madman, a woman with impossible speed and enough firepower in a suitcase to topple the government, and a quadriplegic who might be the most dangerous thing on the planet. Villains who will never stop, and a hero who will never kill. Even with the alien fleet from planet Earth on its way to help against Knives, our small cast and dual cowboy heroes fight against the odds for the sake of tomorrow. Volume 11 is the most quiet and relaxed of the 4 books, which is appreciated because the previous volumes were a giant gunfight. Volume 11 also is the shortest, with each volume after this getting longer and longer, which is something I actually quite appreciate about this series. It's a lot more controlled in its pacing than a lot of manga are, because the volume length is made to match the series instead of a predetermined page count. Anyway, 0 Hour puts all the pieces in place for the climax, and characters are reintroduced, relationships are defined, rivalries begin, people take their positions, the scale of events increases, old, almost forgotten plot points finally come back, and there are hints towards Vash's strategy against Knives. It also introduces something that is both really interesting and really annoying. Long-struggling supporting characters Meryl Streep and Millie Thompson make their return, and if there is a positive here is that they have very well-defined personalities now. There are some genuinely emotional moments with them, especially for Meryl. But there's a problem with their inclusion in this arc, and it's that their personalities more closely match the anime's interpretation of these characters rather than the manga's interpretation. Which makes sense because the anime gave them more prominence in the story and made them more well-developed. Well, maybe not Meryl, but certainly Millie. On the surface, that's a good idea, but it leads to some inconsistencies with the actual manga. Millie doesn't have a particularly close relationship with Wolfwood in the manga, and while she is a good and emotional person, she shouldn't have such a strong reaction to his absence as she does in this storyline. Which is something of a running trend in the final arc. Nightow isn't just resolving his own storyline, he is writing this to be the end of the Trigun franchise as a whole. A major line in the final volume only works if you've either read the pilot chapter for the manga or watched the anime. There is a fantastic montage of old friends and past adventures that includes characters created for and solely used in the anime adaptation. As somebody who has a fondness for the anime version of Trigun, I appreciate all of this. However, it does somewhat lessen the impact of the manga as its own standalone work. With the arrival of a fleet of ships from the Earth, the scale increases dramatically, and the fleet adds another layer of conflict for these events. And they do come with a much broader view of what the plants actually are, including the independent plants. Vash and Knives are not alone in the universe. There are other independent plants, and some of them have followed the same path as Knives before, while others have worked alongside humanity before. However, the series still manages to make Knives an imposing threat. While his rebellion against mankind is not completely unique in itself, how it is presented and the scale he has taken things is all of his own. This whole element of the story might not work for everybody, but the series handles this new alien faction well enough. Only a few characters have names, 2 characters act as the symbols for the humans and the earth plants, and only one of them really has any real character-defining moments or a character arc. But that character arc is good, and the series does get some good use out of Knives' rapid planning and increased power as he fights against both his normal targets and a plant-human alliance from beyond the stars, which works quite well. Something about the much bigger scale that doesn't work is the attempt to flesh out the government of the setting. I don't know why Volume 11 puts so much focus on politics and the military. The government and the world building have never been important to this series. The setting is so inconsequential besides being a big, lifeless desert that the planet the series takes place on is first named in the second to last chapter. So this reads like a failed attempt to give a different perspective to the story. Made worse by the fact I still don't know who this Ludia woman is. I don't know what her role in the story is meant to be and why she is supposedly important. We only get a very loose understanding of what the plants are throughout Volume 11 because the story was about how Vash and Knives use that power instead of where they come from or how that power is clinically defined. And that was fine. What is important are the reactions of the masses, and those work really well here. People under martial law with the final death of their world flying towards them. The art really sells the misery and the heat of the area, while poetic dialogue claims that mankind was never meant to live here and that their cleansing should be expected. It edges on outright cynicism and works a lot better than any attempt of showing generals and leaders talking to each other or stonewall each other from making actual progress in handling the situation so our heroes can be more loose cannon underdogs. There is also one element in this final arc that I feel is undercut by the sheer scale of everything else happening around it. I won't spoil it. A decision is made, we see the immediate consequences and the motivation behind that decision. It's incredibly well done, but the characters and the series don't have time to dwell on this, which is a shame because it's one of the most important things that could happen in Trigun. And it involves so much build-up that it feels like something that absolutely needed to happen, but its placement in the story demands that we focus on something else entirely. So the impact of the scene is diluted. It's a waste, really. Volume 11's final strength is something that feeds into the rest of the arc, and that is the use of Levo and the recent death of Wolfwood. If you thought a character literally being dead and buried would stop me from talking about him, or stop Nightow from finding interesting ways to explore him and his impact on the series, you were wrong. It's a really good use of character death. Wolfwood is given a presence that defines many key scenes that he would not have had otherwise. Even when he isn't named, it's obvious people are talking about him. And it feeds into the story in a major way, deeply affects events and the characters for various reasons, and some of them aren't positive reasons. Although its impact is mostly positive for Levo the Double Fang, as he tries to save the world and be better. It's not just that Wolfwood died for him, it's that Levo lives for Wolfwood, and we see him construct his new identity for himself and become a new man because of it. While he takes Wolfwood's role as Vash's ally, he has his own voice and fights completely differently. He knows he isn't Wolfwood, he isn't trying to actually replace Wolfwood, and he doesn't act like Wolfwood. The story never treats him like he is the same character, and he develops his own style of comedy, his own relationships, struggles, and fighting style over the course of the arc. And despite the utter lunacy of the final arc, Nightow manages to make Levo a unique character and his quest for redemption different from the rest of the cast. Now that he's not completely stoic, he finally reads like a weak person attempting to be strong and trying to live by example while his world crashes down around him, while also being more openly hopeful about things than Wolfwood ever was. Both Wolfwood and Levo were tied to the Eyes of Michael, but Levo is much more deeply connected to the group's methods, beliefs, and practices than his friend was, which completely justifies Wolfwood's death and sacrifice, because the series gains something new that Wolfwood would never have provided. Levo offers more insight into that organization and their methods. Also, Levo has a regeneration ability that basically is an excuse to have him mutilated whenever possible to create interesting visuals and provide a more extreme use of blood and gore in his fights than most of the others. Levo also gets a haircut as soon as possible, which is a vast improvement over the feather-like mohawk he had to begin with. Razlo, the Trip of Death, who I can finally talk about now, is still an odd addition to his character. He's Levo's more psychologically unstable and enthusiastically aggressive split personality. But they don't seem to hate each other. Normally when a character has a psychopath living inside their head, they tend to resent each other. But Razlo is basically Levo's guardian angel and talks like an older brother despite being the younger persona, and Levo does seem to care for him as well. You can almost forget that this genuine, touching relationship is built on Levo being mentally ill to an impossible level, because Razlo acts like the most useful and healthy dissociative disorder I have ever seen anyone have. The Double Fang is blessed with some of the most interesting and aggressive action in the entire series for this final arc. One of his big heroic moments is the strangest and easiest to follow case of gunfire in the entire series, partly because he is quickly building his grudge against Elendira throughout the early parts of the arc, leading to an impressively brutal and fast duel right through to a really grisly, if hard to read, ending. This also better builds Elendira's character, while also giving her goals and schemes beyond knives to counter Levo's faith in Vash. It's a volume that is shorter than all the others and sets the stage well. The action is creative and surprisingly easy to follow. Also, Vash hates Elendira for some reason. She's a very unpleasant person, and also put a nail through his body, so it's not unjustified. It's just odd that he's harsher towards her than all of the other ones. Maybe it's because he isn't actually terrified of her. Speaking of people Vash doesn't like, Levo being a major character is also a much more interesting exploration of Vash's ability to forgive people than anything else in the entire series. Previous arcs have had him beg people not to kill each other, and forgiving a woman who raised him for her past sins. When a man who devoted his entire life to killing Vash laid it all bare and broke down cursing his very name, Vash held his hand solely so he wouldn't have to die alone. Vash can forgive basically anything done towards him, but he struggles to forgive the evils inflicted on other people, especially the ones he loves. And it's very clear at the end of Volume 10 and during Volume 11 that Vash is trying to trust Levo because that's what Wolfwood would have wanted to happen. But there is a constant sense that Vash doesn't like Levo at all. And why would he? He doesn't actually know Levo. He's just a friend of a friend who is directly responsible for their mutual friend's brutal death. And before Wolfwood's passing, Vash only saw the violent persona Levo hides, and Razlo was gleefully trying to kill him. Vash has no reason to trust him beyond it being important to Wolfwood and needing somebody's help to stop knives. It's a really awkward relationship that really doesn't get a resolution that I would have liked, but it adds another layer to the hero and does play into the story in an interesting way. Still, they are allies at the end of the world, and they need to rely on each other to get the job done. Some side characters get some interesting moments where they comment on this dynamic and interacting with the new stranger Vash is working with.
Volume 12, Gunslinger, which is the second volume in this series to have that title for no good reason, begins with a beautiful reflection on the series before suddenly going completely insane and the rest of the series going forward becoming an all-out battle for survival. It's an amazing scene that captures Vash's journey and feelings perfectly. Again, the thinking scenes in Trigun were never the problem. Having read this a few times, I managed to understand what's happening in the giant battle as it unfolds, and I can now just focus on the art's quality, even though there are still some poorly presented moments I don't fully understand. It's an angel of blades and raw flesh fighting a space armada over the last city of man, while cowboys and destroyers rush to get into position to stop the other side from winning.
It's very fast-paced, and it's a case of Nightow's visual creativity working in his favour and possibly his unintended skill at drawing chaos working really well. And while he has always used a lot of detail in his art, Nightow has finally, mostly, managed to combine it with clear imagery, giant attacks, readable panel layouts, good spacecraft design, quick reactions, and understandable, if unusual, body language. Even the moments where the arms and legs don't bend normally work fine here because the image is suitably dramatic and it's possible the characters are actually meant to be bending and snapping their bodies back into fighting shape. Levo's fighting style is acrobatic and leg-focused, which Nightow manages to make work now after failing in Volume 9, although there are some really interesting uses of blood splatter that cannot work in the environment of the arc, but provide very striking images. Knives becomes this creature of bloodlust and body horror through his interactions with the Earth Fleet. Faces, particularly mouths, express a lot without characters having to say anything. And there's some really good uses of Vash's sunglasses. Pain is a very major part of this arc. Exhaustion, agony, sorrow, desperation, all communicated through the art and the darker moments of the darkest hour. There are a lot of scenes that feature people writhing in the dirt of an uncaring, half-dead world, trying to put themselves back on their feet. And there are some really good drawing of hands. I've never noticed it until now, but Volume 13 has some very well-drawn hands and expressive fingers. Maybe that's been a part of this series I've never noticed until now. There is a moment that is confusing because the narrator suddenly shifts, but in terms of the actual story, this volume and arc managed to handle and use all the major characters, both old and new, quite well. Double Duel, in particular, cuts between fights and all of their different stages quickly without being confusing. Knives and Vash debate the nature of humanity once again, and the events happening around them mirror their beliefs, which is normal for this type of series. Most of it is quite obvious. Humanity damns itself while also saving itself. Fear of the unknown makes the masses weak, but faith makes them strong. The normal beats that this type of conflict will hit. Thankfully, Vash explains the conflict as being much more complex than either he or Knives want to believe it to be. Zazie the Beast also offers some interesting perspectives on the conflict between humanity and plants, although the Beast is quite suddenly and haphazardly dropped out of the story, presumably because we were done with the living insect colony in the shape of a girl. None of the conclusions reached in this are going to be revelations to the audience. They're all quite simple and succinct ideas. But I think the series does eventually make up its mind and answer the moral questions it has been asking, while also maintaining that strange brotherly love Knives has towards Vash in spite of everything. It's been a huge part of his character for a long time, and that finally comes to a head here. Now, a plot point that is very questionable is the long-absent coin case. Back in the original Trigun and throughout the whole of Maximum, the Gung-Ho Guns, Knives' followers and Legato's henchmen, have been carrying these coins that are meant to be given to Vash, like they are gym badges at a Pokemon League. This finally has a point, and I have to question it. It's very clear that the coin case wasn't meant to do this originally, and it raises several questions about its deployment, I suppose. Legato giving it to Vash, knowing what it does, makes a certain amount of sense for his character. The problem is that the case's origins, and that it was such a minor plot point for such a long time, that Vash actually lost it for 3 whole years, and didn't think about it for volumes upon volumes at a time. That's the real problem. It really feels like an afterthought Nightow finally decided to address, and I can't promise that it's an ideal resolution for anyone. That's not the only established element that is explained oddly in its relationship with Legato. His mysterious mental powers get an interesting explanation that leads into some amazing and truly terrible moments. The problem is that it flies directly in the face of continuity.
and leads to some of Legato's previously shown abilities making absolutely no sense whatsoever. Legato's first appearance has him being able to move through crowded areas without being seen or possibly anyone being able to remember him, and he's also able to communicate telepathically with Vash. These are both major parts of his introduction. Their use is in many ways the turning point of the entire series. Neither of them make any sense with the explanation and are never referenced again. This isn't a problem with Elendira, because nothing about her amazing speed, her weapons, her other abilities, or her history are really explained besides what she is doing, and I think you are just meant to roll with it, which actually works quite well in context, because Legato's powers do get an explanation. It just doesn't fit with these other skills that he has, and he just stopped using them, presumably when Nightow decided that this was going to be the reveal. The only reason that I could ignore these very clear problems is that what is done with Legato's powers and his character are actually really interesting. I haven't given Legato's character the focus it deserves in these videos, primarily because his main appearances have been at the major turning points of arc climaxes to make everything worse for everybody, and that makes his role in the story often quite difficult to explain without just spoiling everything. Legato Blue Summers is interesting because he is the ideal nemesis for Vash the Stampede, and he has become so honest-to-goodness warped since his original appearance as a calm mastermind. As time has gone on, Legato has become more and more deranged, his fanatical loyalty clashing with his desire to prove himself, which also conflicts with his massive self-loathing, thinly veiled sadism, empathy, a violent temper, clear suicidal thoughts, and endless determination, working himself up into a frenzy before suddenly snapping back to lucidity and talking calmly. Which makes it interesting that he is the narrator for a huge part of the final arc, especially as Legato has never explained himself to anyone besides the reader. So while his actions certainly do follow a twisted sense of reason, no one in the story can ever really understand him. They just have to react to him. Which is interesting because this type of series would normally have the hero's perspective, or attempt to give both sides similar focus. Instead, the evil monster is the centerpiece. Meanwhile, Vash's character is defined by his actions during this arc. In fact, Vash is near silent after Volume 12 gets underway, as if he has simply said everything that needs to be said and is just communicating through his actions, which results in Vash being presented as this something that should be feared because of his sheer power, especially in Legato's splintered mind, which almost makes Legato seem more human by comparison, despite the fact he has near godlike powers and that Vash is always the hero of our story. It's an honest attempt at visual storytelling from an artist who has struggled with that, and it honestly works quite well. Legato's interpretation of Vash's determination is very important, but the series doesn't confirm that his pessimistic outlook is correct either. The people around him treat Vash's struggle as either pitiful or noble, while the story shows that it could be both at different times and sometimes even at the same time. While Vash is a pretty likable character with important moments and history and ideals, with the final arc giving him one of his best moments in the entire series. But many key scenes in this series have been about how other characters view his behavior and analyze him, which is true even in the finale. Legato, unlike Levo and Meryl, starts viewing Vash's willingness to fight in a tragic light, and it impacts his choices during the arc, in spite of his bitter hatred towards Vash the Stampede. Legato wants to break Vash because he hates him. He also wants Vash to break him because he hates himself. But he also wants to prove himself to Knives while also going against his orders. But he also empathizes with Vash while also viewing Vash as a superior life form above a worthless human like himself. Nightow gives Legato
dozens of expressions that he cycles through extremely quickly that highlight just how manic and unstable he is becoming. And he ultimately comes across as a very sad, pathetic monster, especially with his past. Parts of Legato's backstory were foreshadowed in the Trigun series, and the full thing is just as awful as you would expect. Not exactly original, but Legato's dark and twisted feelings really come off the page. Volume 13 puts a lot of focus on Legato, and it works. He narrates his own past with the dispassionate, hateful tone you would expect from Legato Blue Summers. He is misanthropic and nihilistic. Even his own past is rooted in how much he doesn't value anyone or anything except for knives. And there is no force on the planet that can upheave his devotion. In spite of working towards such an awful goal, Legato doesn't come across as insane. Legato comes across as if he's very, very sick. That is the best way I have of describing it. In the past, he has wildly shifted from violent outbursts to heartbroken tears. In the present, he is suddenly jumping between the calm man he was at the start of the series and a deranged animal. It's not clear if he can even feel pain anymore because the only person he ever loved broke his spine, which leads to some major problems and interesting uses of Legato's powers, especially because there's the possibility he can't feel pain anymore. Elendira finally gets to be a major fighter during this arc. She's nowhere near as interesting, but she presents such an overwhelming threat that causes so much horrific violence that her weaker characterization is almost passable. Almost. She seems a lot more focused on ending the world than she seemed to be at the beginning. In the past, she seemed to believe that there was no future where knives didn't kill them all, and was just supporting him because she thought he was interesting, and this would let her live the longest. Here, she is extremely loyal to Knives' plan, even preparing her own scheme in case Knives is defeated that will allow her to wipe out the world. It's inconsistent, but at least gives her an excuse to duel Levo. Besides the art problems that have plagued the series, which do kneecap some moments that have honestly needed to be better, her being a poorly developed character is the only weakness of Levo's arc. Which is a shame, because Legato is also like Elendira in that he's just a henchman. He is literally fixated on the idea of being the ideal henchman for his master. Yet he's a fully realized character who's been built up as a villain over a dozen volumes. His choice of weapon is absurd and doesn't fit his character though, although I suppose it does count as overwhelming, but Legato doesn't really seem like the person who would use something so ornate. And while there is some really cool choreography and interesting visuals, I'm not entirely sure what's happening at some moments during Levo's battle with Elendira. There are some really great emotional scenes and turnarounds that I'm not sure I understand how they work, or if they're meant to be ambiguous. But it's a good duel that takes advantage of Levo's weapons, methods, training, and personality. I have no idea how Elendira's suitcase gun works, how she loads it with giant nails, or how she lands the shots the way she lands them. It just looks cool, which is at the heart of their duel. It's cool and possibly wilder and more imaginative than Vash's fight with Legato. Now, while these different battles among the different factions are well done and detailed and have interesting reflective character moments, there are problems. One fight ends and I immediately understand how it ended, but I have no idea how that could happen physically with the way it's presented, because the art is unclear or being inconsistent in major moments. Despite being theoretically one of my favourite endings to any fight in any manga. The other features an ending where I understand the build-up to how it happens, but actually understanding the final blow took me several readings for me to fully comprehend what happens at the end. Nightow's art fails spectacularly in two separate directions within the span of chapters, and I cannot, for the life of me, understand how that's possible within such a short span of time. Even after all these years and all this improvement, he still finds ways to confound me. And then there is the absolute endgame of the series, which is perfect and has no art problems and concludes the story in the most ideal way. That's the Trigun experience in a nutshell. Deeply flawed until it isn't. Then it becomes an interesting action series. And overall, I think that the final stretch of Trigun Maximum is what it needed to be. It builds on the established nature of things, and it answers every question raised about pacifism, forgiveness, and redemption in the series as it closes the book on the saga of Vash the Stampede. Something about the pacing and the page layouts really help the art style, and the series is perfectly readable in the final showdown of the series. There are some really striking pages, some of which I can't explain why I like them as much as I do. Maybe it's just the number of full page and 2-page spreads slowing things down so you can drink in every moment. You have to accept the series' view on human nature and the weird, strangely defined science fiction beings known as plants the series has been about for the ending to work on the grander scale. And on the subject of the wider scope of the series, maybe a more involved epilogue would have been able to close off everything in the story's world more than the brief snippets of the survivors that the series itself gives. But Trigun ends the way it had to end. It was a simple story that scraped up the depth it could from its deeply imperfect and limited beginning. While other characters have been given more focus and his struggles have often been shown from other people's perspectives, Vash's ideals and desires drive everything. So as the final statement of the character and his journey, Nightow does a very good job. And Dark Horse went an extra mile in printing the series because the last chapter has a very interesting publishing choice that I really appreciate and wonder why most other manga companies don't do it more often. I think Volume 14's cover and title are actually a lot more cheerful than the actual resolution, which is quite bittersweet in its own way. It should have been called Ticket to the Future. Mind Games is a bad title to give to the last volume. So with 2 weaker finishes, some rushed plotting, clumsy attempts to bring the entire Trigun franchise to a close, and a darn good conclusion, the final 4 volumes of Trigun Maximum match the series they end. The series is not perfect by any means. In fact, I can't think of a single arc that is close to perfect, and there is always something to complain about. But from its half-formed, limited beginnings, the series has evolved to the point where its strengths in writing and character outweigh the shrinking artistic weaknesses. The end result of Yasuhiro Nightow's Trigun and Trigun Maximum is an interesting action series that excels in characterization and imaginative takes on normal manga ideas, even if the art can't quite communicate them. If you have been reading along, know the series ends well and achieves what it set out to do. If you've been on the fence about this manga, please note the series eventually outgrows many of its faults over time, with the art becoming mostly good instead of just awful. Ultimately, finally, I can say that Trigun is a good manga worth your time. Currently, one of my favourites, warts and all. Thank you for watching, thank you for your patience, good night, and have pleasant dreams.